One of Iwata's newest airbrushes is the ECLIPSE Takumi, and it goes without saying that I'm a huge Iwata fan. I think they make some of the best airbrushes out today. I bought this one a few months ago, paying around $200 for it, and in this week's video, let's take a look at the Iwata ECLIPSE Takumi and see how it compares with other airbrushes. The first thing I want to talk about is the build. Like all Iwatas, the fit and finish is flawless. The chrome is as good as it gets, and there isn't a single imperfection on this finish. When I think of good quality control, two airbrush brands come to mind. That's Iwata and Harder & Steenbeck. And so there's no surprises here with the ECLIPSE Takumi. It's a 10 out of 10 for the build quality. This airbrush comes equipped with a 0.35mm needle and nozzle. A nozzle size of 0.35 is kind of like the Goldilocks zone in airbrush design. You could spray plenty of detail with it, get very tight, small lines, and also it's more forgiving to spray some thicker paints. And the needle and nozzle are both perfectly aligned within the airbrush. The ECLIPSE Takumi comes with a large 7ml paint cup, which is about 1/4 of an ounce. So this could be very useful if you're working on a larger project and using a lot of paint. This paint cup is held in by friction and it's removable, so you could place it on the left side or the right side of the airbrush. The paint cup also unscrews from the base, and if you'd like, you can swap this out with the smaller 3ml cup, which Iwata sells separately. But if you own the Neo for Iwata or a Harder & Steenbeck Evolution or Infinity, these cups will also work as an alternative. I doubt that Iwata would approve of this, but it's what I've been using for the past year or so on my custom Micron Takumi, and it's worked out great. Obviously, the smaller cup is going to hold less paint, but to me, it feels more comfortable. Like all side feed airbrushes, the ECLIPSE Takumi might feel a bit lopsided if you're coming from a traditional gravity-fed brush. And it's even more apparent if you're using this large 5ml cup that comes with the airbrush. But again, like all side feed airbrushes, this is something that I usually get accustomed to very quickly. And if you want to switch to that smaller cup, the option's always there. And of course, an added bonus about a side feed cup is that you could switch this to the left side of the airbrush if you're a lefty. This way you'll have a clear line of sight to whatever it is that you're painting. The rear handle has a few extra features, which is always nice to see. There's a cutout in the center of it, and if you'd like, you could use this to quickly flush out any clogs that build up within the nozzle. And at the very back of the rear handle is a screw, which acts as a needle limiter. If you tighten this down, it limits how far you're able to pull back the trigger. So if you'd like, you could set this screw to a certain point so that the airbrush always sprays the same amount of paint when you pull all the way back on the trigger. If you're new to painting with an airbrush, this could be helpful in the beginning so you don't spray too much paint. And if you're interested, inside the box you get an Iwata sticker. You also get some documentation, which is a quick start guide and a spray pattern of your particular airbrush. It also comes with a small tube of Iwata lube, and if you'd like, you could place a small amount of this on the needle. A little bit definitely goes a long way, and this just helps the needle slide through the needle packing screw easier. You also get a small wrench to remove the nozzle and a cap to put on the paint cup. Compared to the Iwata ECLIPSE HPCS, the build on these two are quite different. Beside the obvious differences in the paint cup between a gravity fed and a side fed, one major difference is the position of the trigger. You could see here that the trigger on the Takumi is a lot closer to the nozzle than on the original ECLIPSE. This allows you to really choke up on the airbrush and get closer to the subject that you're painting. And because it's a side feed, you have a lot more room in front of the trigger for your finger. With a larger gravity-fed paint cup like this ECLIPSE, sometimes it feels like the trigger is a bit cramped in there. For me personally, doesn't really make a difference. I find both to be very comfortable, but for those of you who want more room for your trigger finger, a side feed might be a better option. Compared to the custom Micron Takumi, in the hand, both of these airbrushes feel very similar. The major differences between the two is the needle and nozzle sizes and the way they spray. This ECLIPSE Takumi sprays very similar, if not identical, to the Iwata ECLIPSE HPCS. So the main differences between these three airbrushes is that these two, the ECLIPSE HPCS and the ECLIPSE Takumi, spray pretty much identically. And then the custom Micron Takumi and the ECLIPSE Takumi both spray very differently, but they handle about the same while you're painting because both are side feed, both have the trigger closer to the nozzle, and the trigger design is identical. The ergonomics on this trigger are absolutely incredible. I think it's one of the best designs out today. The grip on the top of it is excellent, it never slips, and also the front has a slight curve down, and this perfectly conforms to your finger. I've always found the standard round triggers that you find on every other airbrush to be very comfortable, but over the last few years of using my custom Micron Takumi, which has the same trigger design, I've come to prefer this one over any other trigger, and it's my new favorite. So let's move along to the breakdown so that you can see the internal parts. After unscrewing the rear handle and this chuck, you're able to remove the needle. From here, you're able to control your trigger tension with this needle spring guide. If you tighten this screw down, you'll get a better seal between the needle tip and the nozzle. And this spring assembly is exactly the same as you'd see in the Iwata ECLIPSE HPCS. This consists of 3 parts: the needle spring, the chucking guide, which has this trigger lever connected to it, and the needle spring guide, which houses it all together. It's a simple design, extremely well built, and it's very quick to break down. After you remove the needle, this trigger lifts right out of the body of the airbrush. And as I said before, the design is the same one that you'd see in the custom Micron Takumi, but the bottom is different, so they're not interchangeable. This one has a small hinge with a guide on it that presses down on the air piston. Moving along to the front of the airbrush, the first thing we have here is the needle crown cap. You can paint with this on or off, and it just screws on a small thread. This next part that I'm screwing is the nozzle cap, and this always needs to be left on for the airbrush to spray paint. And if you unscrew this, you have access to the tip of the nozzle. Occasionally this will build up some paint, so it's a good idea to clean it off once in a while. And to unscrew the head cap, you don't need any soft jaw pliers, just use this wrench that comes with the airbrush, and you could use this to loosen it up and then just unscrew the rest by hand. Once this cap is off, you're able to remove the nozzle, and this nozzle is free floating, which is great, so it's just held in by compression. So if you ever damage it or you need to replace this after a few years of use, it's really easy to do. It only takes a few seconds. And you can see on this head cap that it has 3 holes which evenly direct the airflow over the tip of the nozzle. And a feature that I love to see on an airbrush is just a simple O-ring like this on the front. When an airbrush has an O-ring like this, you almost never have an air leak on the front, so I'm always happy to see this. And inside the body of the airbrush is the needle packing screw, which has a PTFE seal that prevents paint from leaking back into the body of the airbrush. And of course, on the bottom is the air valve assembly. I have a quick adapter on here. Unfortunately, Iwata doesn't include a quick adapter with any of their airbrushes. So if you use any of those quick disconnect adapters that I like to use, just know you're going to have to buy them separately. So the build and quality control on this airbrush are really as good as it gets. Everything is machined perfectly and there's no imperfections or blemishes anywhere on this airbrush. No surprises here, but of course I'm very happy to see this. Let's move along to the spray test, and the first thing I'm checking here is the response rate. On Iwata's website, they state that this airbrush is for artisans looking for unparalleled responsiveness, and I really have to agree with them. The response rate is just incredible. If you look at my finger, I'm barely pulling it back, just the slightest nudge on the trigger, and I get paint at the same point every time. A very cool design about the Takumi line is that even though they're side feed, they're gravity assisted. So the airbrush is actually pulling the paint from the bottom of the cup rather than pulling it up like a traditional side feed. This, along with the trigger and nozzle head design, just give incredible control. The response rate of the trigger is one of the most important parts of an airbrush for me, so I'm just very pleased with this one. Checking the line consistency of the spray pattern, you can see here that this is absolutely perfect. There's no sort of imperfections or splatters within the paint, just one consistent line. So the atomization of the paint and the trigger response are both excellent. Let's take a look at how well the ECLIPSE Takumi can spray fine lines and detail work. So looking at these 6 lines, tell me if you could decide which 3 of these were painted with the ECLIPSE Takumi and which 3 were painted with the Micron Takumi. I honestly can't tell the difference looking at this now. And remember that any airbrush with a nozzle size of 0.35 or smaller is going to give you about the same size line as long as you reduce the paint and hold the airbrush very close to the surface that you're painting. The 3 lines on top were painted with the custom Micron, which has a 0.18mm needle and nozzle, and the 3 lines on the bottom were painted with the ECLIPSE Takumi, which has a 0.35mm needle and nozzle. In order to paint thin lines like this, the trick is all about reducing the paint, holding the airbrush right off of the surface you're painting, and then dropping the PSI down to around 15 or so. When the paint is thin like this, you just need to be careful because if you add too much, it can very quickly spider out. And moving along here to the custom Micron Takumi, you can see that I get about the same size line width. So with both of these airbrushes, I can get a line just about as thin as a human hair, maybe slightly larger, but around that size. When I measure the airspeed of this airbrush, I get a number right around 6.2 meters per second. So this is on the higher side, but it's usually what you expect to see with a general use airbrush. With a higher airspeed and a medium-sized nozzle, the Eclipse Takumi puts out a lot of paint compared to a detail airbrush. So I switched over to the Eclipse Takumi from my Micron as I was working on this small painting. And I have to say, the trigger control is just phenomenal. It did exactly what I wanted it to. Since this airbrush puts out a higher volume of paint, you need to be careful when you're spraying in some detail work. Although the trigger control is great, this airbrush is less forgiving than a Micron if you're painting detail work. The reason for that is that I found it pretty easy to accidentally spray too much paint. But with that said, if you're careful and you work slow, you can still get an incredible amount of detail with this airbrush. According to Iwata's website, the recommended working pressure of this airbrush is from 25 to 35 psi. I'm spraying at around 25 here and it works great, atomizes the paint beautifully, but with that higher airspeed at this psi, you definitely feel a lot of that air blowing back off the painting. But if you ever painted with the Iwata Eclipse HPCS or the Badger Patriot 105, you'll probably find this airspeed very comfortable because it sprays very similar to those two airbrushes. So obviously, I'm very glad that I picked up this airbrush and happy to add it to the collection. And if you're looking for a professional side feed airbrush, the Eclipse Takumi is definitely one to check out. It's great for anyone who's looking for a high-end airbrush that'll last a lifetime. So I do hope that this video is helpful. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll be back here next Friday.